Hi, my name is Sapir Sella, and I am super excited to be presenting this project. I'm super passionate about this topic, and I think you guys might really like it too. So, this topic is kind of a combination of two things I'm really passionate, which is investment numbers and then quantitative approaches to sports. So, sports and investment, which is something that I've always wanted to get into. So the name of my project is a quantitative approach to investing in a sports complex. So the issue that I have kind of focused on for this project is a hypothetical problem located in Fargo, North Dakota. And I chose Fargo, North Dakota because that's where I am located at the moment. And I am currently involved in a lot of sports in the area. So I found that this is an issue that we are having in North Dakota, especially in Fargo. And so this hypothetical problem, investors have $1.6 million to invest in a sports complex with a combination of pickleball, tennis, basketball, and squash courts. And the investors want to focus specifically on pickleball. This is because pickleball is just a tremendously fast-growing sport. And so they want to bring in other sports as well so that other people that are not necessarily into pickleball can maybe get into pickleball or bring their friends. And so they just want to be able to include several kinds of athletes that are not only pickleball, but really the focus is on pickleball, and you'll see that with the constraints that I mentioned later on. And so the approach for this problem is to utilize a linear programming model, and I'll discuss in the next slide here why a linear programming model. Well, the reason I picked this model is because I wanted to maximize the daily profits for this investment. And there are many constraints that I'll go over in the next couple of slides. And so utilizing those constraints, those decision variables, I want to maximize daily profits. And so I thought that a linear programming model would be best since there are a certain number of constraints that are available that kind of limit the growth or the growth of the daily profit. And so as you'll see later on, this is definitely the right model for my scenario. So to begin to work on this linear programming model, I first had to come up with decision variables, and I tried to make it as simple as possible. I assigned the number of tennis courts that will be built to T, the number of pickleball courts to be built, P, basketball courts, B, S, squash, right? And like I said before, the objective here, what we're really trying to do is find the optimal combination of courts. To go forward here, the data that I used is the table that you see here. I really just wanted to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. And so I assigned a cost to each court. So to build or construct a tennis court, I decided that $40,000 would be the cost. Pickleball would be 20,000, basketball 50, squash 50,000. And I decided these costs based on just some light research, like about how much money would it cost, but I really didn't want to get too focused on the accuracy of the cost because it was really the purpose of the project is to kind of understand how costs and constraints kind of impact the optimal function and without really focusing on specifics, because for that I would need to get proposals and you know, kind of get real numbers from companies where that wasn't really the objective. So I do have these hypothetical numbers that I kind of came up with, and the kind of the difference between each one is definitely realistic though. So tennis would cost more than a pickleball court. However, a basketball court would cost more than a pickleball court, and so on. So the next column that you'll see is the max playing. This refers to the maximum numbers, the average maximum number of players that could play on each court really at a time. For tennis, as you might know, there is a maximum of two on each side, so that'd be four. Same for pickleball. Maximum for basketball is 10. Squash, in my hypothetical, is also 10. That's kind of just the numbers that I wanted to go with. and I thought they would make sense for my model, and as you'll see, they kind of do play a great role here. So as I go forward, the daily profit is $100 each day for tennis, 200 for pickleball, squash is 80, and then basketball is 60. And I also selected these based on a hypothetical number, but I did select it also with proportion to popularity of the sport. So in Fargo, North Dakota, and really the purpose of this investment is the focus is on pickleball. So most people are going to be playing pickleball, and that's where the popularity is really focused. So that's the highest profit, then tennis and squash, then basketball, because they're really focused on, racket sports. Moving on is to the objective function. The objective of this project is to maximize daily profits utilizing the data in the table. And the objective function I came up with is utilizing the daily profit column, and it's 100T, so that's $100 a day per tennis court, per each tennis court, which is important to note, plus $200 per day for each pickleball court, plus $60 per day per basketball court, plus $80 per day per squash court. And so basically what we want the model to do is to give us the number of each court with their corresponding profit that will maximize the total number of daily earned profit using, of course, the constraints that I will explain. So the investors have a budget of $1.6 million, and I played around with this number since this is all hypothetical, and I kind of came up with this number because anything lower than that would really not make it feasible, and anything above that is not really necessary, practical, or reasonable. So the constraint for the budget is 40,000 T, which if you look back here at the table, 40,000 is the cost to construct, build a tennis court, plus 20,000 P, which is the cost to construct a pickleball court, plus 50,000 B, plus 50,000 X, basketball and squash. And so this constraint really says that the cost to build all the courts should be less than or equal to 1.6 million, because we can only go up to that 1.6 million. And so if it costs any more than that, it wouldn't work. The second constraint is to build out at least one of each type of court. So the investors, like I mentioned before, really wanted to allow different athletes and different sports lovers to come to the facility and enjoy it. And so one of those constraints is that to enable everyone to have at least one type of court, so that even if the model doesn't think one court is optimal, to at least build one of those. So I split that up into I split that up into 4 of the courts. So the first court, T must be greater than or equal to 1, meaning tennis must have at least one court built. Then pickleball must have at least one court built. So, and then so forth. So that was important to the investors, so I included it in there, and I thought it would kind of make the problem a little bit more reasonable, practical, realistic, just because I think that's what an investor would think as well. The third constraint is to have a capacity of at least 300. So that means that there should be at least 300 people at the facility per day. That is just to make sure that we have enough people participating, coming to the facility and enjoying the different courts. And to have that constraint, if we go back here, you can see that the maximum players that can play is 4 for tennis. So just use those figures, 4T plus 4B. So just the max for each court, just to ensure that the investors have some kind of ballpark of how many maximum people could be playing at the facility. So the fourth constraint is to have at least double the number of pickleball courts to tennis courts. So I illustrated that with 2T should be less than or equal to P. And I rearranged the inequality to make sure that I'd have a 0 on the right-hand side so that the model would be able to work. And so the reason I wrote it out like this is because if you imagine if there are 2 tennis courts, there should be 4 pickleball courts at least. And so that was really important to the investors so that there would be a lot of pickleball courts to ensure that pickleball players could be able to play at pretty much any given time. And so there definitely should be more double the pickleball courts to tennis courts. The fifth constraint states that it should be up to and including 10 tennis courts, 20 pickle, 10 basketball, and 10 squash. So to add another kind of constraint for the number of courts, this was important so that the model doesn't create an infinity number of courts or some ridiculously high number of courts that doesn't make sense. So the investors have provided me with these limitations so that I can tell a model do not create a number of courts greater than these respective limits. And then the last and final constraint here is non-negativity because we can't have negative courts built. That's pretty obvious. But then also more importantly is the integer. We don't want the model to tell us to build 0.5674 per pieces of a court, right? We want to have full whole courts. And so that's very important too. So here are our results. So I inputted all the data into Excel and ran it through Solver, and this is what it came up with. So the optimal solution is 5 tennis courts, 20 pickleball courts, 10 basketball courts, and 10 squash courts. And with that combination of courts, we can expect a daily profit of $5,900. Whew, that is a lot of courts. Hopefully the investors have the space that they committed to having because that is a lot of courts. But that is also a really, really nice return on investment. So then after I got my results, I then went on to do a sensitivity analysis, and this is what it came up with. So the reduced cost is how much the objective function coefficient would need to improve before the variable of that coefficient could take on a positive value in the optimal solution. So if we look at the reduced cost here, there is none because we have those final values there. And they are positive coefficients. And if we look on to the next column, we see the objective coefficient. And then we see the allowable increase and decrease. And those are the ranges of optimality for those objective coefficients. So those objective coefficients can increase or decrease within those ranges before the optimal solution is no longer optimal. So they can kind of go through that. And once they go over or below those allowable increases or decreases, then it's no longer optimal. So the investors should definitely stay between those if they want to maintain that optimality that the model came up with. The next slide is the constraints section of the sensitivity analysis. And so we have 11 constraints. And they're kind of grouped. Some are kind of grouped, they're the same pretty much, so it's not 11 completely different constraints, just like we discussed earlier. But yeah, this is what it came up with. So the final value, that first really meaningful column there, tells us what the constraint came up with, what the final value of that constraint is. So for example, on that first row, we have the budget, and we constraint the budget. The constraint for the budget was 1.6 million, and the model came up with a final value of 1.6 million. So it's using up all of that constraint. And then if we look on to the capacity, for example, it's also using all of that 300 capacity that we enabled it to use. So when we look at shadow price for constraints right-hand side, it's the amount of the objective function value that will change per 1 unit increase. So for each constraint, that might be a little bit different, but We can also see the right-hand side constraints on the column next to it, and those can also increase and decrease within the ranges of the allowable increase and decrease. And so that's important to also know. That's the range of feasibility. But kind of going back to the shadow price for a non-binding constraint is 0. So the shadow price, the ones that you see 0, those are non-binding constraints, and it's likely that the others are binding. So those are some things to keep in mind, that when discussing with investors, it's good to kind of let them know this is where you're at. If you increase the right-hand side, if you increase it by 1, this is how much it would increase. So if you increase your budget by $1, it's going to increase your value by 0.0038. If you increase your capacity by 1, you'll lose $13. So things like that are important to consider when kind of reading the sensitivity analysis. Next, this is also really important, the assumptions and limitations. My entire model is pretty simple. It doesn't have anything extremely intricate, or it doesn't dive really deep into many constraints. So it does have a lot of assumptions and limitations that go with it. So some of the assumptions is that there are constant parameters. So we're assuming that the capacity, staff, seasonality, inflation, price fluctuation, the population winter decline, those kind of things we're assuming aren't going to happen, or we're kind of ignoring that. We're kind of ignoring that there's much less people in Fargo in the winter. And so there might be less people that come into the facility. We're ignoring the fact that typically within the first 6 months of opening a new facility, that's when we have the most people, the most participants, and then it drops rapidly after that. So, those are the kind of things that we're assuming. It's important to note that because it creates a limitation in our model, and typically what we do is our model kind of inflates larger than it kind of should be. Additionally, I'm assuming the entire cost, max player numbers, and daily profit are really accurate. And for example, the cost, assuming that that's the best cost that we can get in the area, but that's not necessarily true. So are we really maximizing daily profits if we haven't looked at other construction companies and so forth? The next bullet is no causation or synergy. So we don't really know, and we're assuming that there is no causation between if I have a pickleball court, but this one person comes in for squash and then they later start playing pickleball, we're not really bringing that into the model, that the causation and synergy between the combination of the courts and the marketing that might go into play. So those really intricate things are not entered into the model, which is expected for this course, but it's something to take note of. Next is that the expenses and the budget deviations are not accounted for, and we're assuming the expenses are limited to the construction of the courts, but we all know very well that there could be licensing fees, there could be other fees, there could be expenses beyond our imagination. And so that's something that we are assuming is not there for the model, but we very well know it would be. Next is that the linear programming model is typically a static tool, and we are not taking into account the evolving customer preferences, the market conditions, the weather, really anything, any factors or characteristics that might kind of impact the market demand and things like that. So it's good to keep that in mind too, because those real life factors will come into play and impact our numbers. The last one that I like to bring up is the construction complications and limitations. So we all know construction takes time. We all know that sometimes construction costs more than it was originally meant to cost. Resources are limited. And so those kind of things will also impact how practical those model results really are. Finally, I would like to talk about the recommendations and conclusions I have for the investors after analyzing the results. So at the top, you will see the original results, and at the bottom, you will see a new model that I created with my own assumptions and my own constraints to show the investors another possible way to approach this. And so if we remove limitation of constraints, so pretty much constraints are definitely something that the investors requested, but if we remove that limitation, at the bottom, you will see that you can already see that the value of the maximum daily profit has increased. And so obviously without getting, approval from investors, you can't go on and change constraints, but just for this project and for the recommendation section, I thought it would be really interesting to create a new model with different constraints. So we're also assuming, this is something I wanted to bring up, is that the assumption of unlimited space in regard to this new model. And so when you look at this new model here that I created, the biggest and I mean the only difference, what I removed in the constraints was if you look at the right-hand column, under 300 is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So there, I basically removed the constraint that each court had to be built once. Later, you'll see up there in highlighted in blue that each court was in fact built more than once, so that constraint didn't even really impact anything. But what did impact the model was the constraint for the number of pickleball courts, the number of basketball courts, and squash. So I increased the maximum for the pickleball courts to 30 from 20, just because those are the most profitable courts, and that's the focus of this project, of this investment, is for pickleball. And then I decreased squash and basketball to 4, although you could probably see that right there, that that was what the model selected right away. So when we look at the original return on investment in the original model, we see that it was $5,900 per day. And if I divide that by the initial investment, that's a 4% daily return on investment, which is huge, right? That's really great. Annually, this is 96% return on investment, which is also a really great number if you look at it in the annual perspective. However, if we look at the new model, the return on investment is 1% higher each day, or 123 annually. And I calculated these annual percentages by multiplying the daily return on investment by 260, and I chose 260 days instead of 365 because I thought that would be a more conservative approach, considering that we can't really expect the daily profit to continue every single day, every single day of the year, 365 days. We have to account for holidays. We have to account for bad weather or any other unforeseen events like COVID or something like that. So all in all, I would recommend the investors to go with this new model approach if they're open to changing up the constraints. Of course, if we're limited with the constraints that the investors have decided on, then we should go with the first model because the first model still gives us a really good return on investment. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you and have a great day.